Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Mormon Matters podcast features panel discussions of topics related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Whether about Mormon teachings, scriptures, contemporary events, or Mormon culture, it seeks to explore all themes with fairness and respect, searching for robust presentations of issues and compassion for all people and questions. The podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and is seeking to build financial support that will help it continue to produce important and helpful content. All donations to Mormon Matters are fully tax deductible. To support the podcast, please become a monthly subscriber today at mormonmatters.org. Thank you for your support.
Where can I turn for peace? Where is my solace? When other sources cease to make me whole.
Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of our discussion. This is post Dr. Nicole Prowse being with us. We so appreciated her and bringing that expertise about what happens in the brain, what happens in the body, and things like this. We're now back to talk about more things that I think are in this weird, complicated, multi-layered, we don't always know our motives kind of area, and how viewing pornography and compulsivity and all those kinds of things, they require new models rather than the addiction model. At least that's the argument here. And so I'm excited to have these three who work with people one-on-one, who've used different modalities to help people who come to them saying, I have a porn addiction, I have a sex addiction, and they've worked through some of these things. And so I'm excited to be with them now, Jay, Kristen, and Natasha. Let me do one thing before we move into your success stories, your reasons for arguing that this is the best treatment directions to go. And that is, can you categorically say that the porn addiction model has done more harm than good for those who have, sought treatment, paid up to $45,000, one of you mentioned before, for whatever reason, however you want to do it. Can you say that it has hurt more people than it has helped? Or another easier way of saying that is like, has it helped anybody in such a way that the percentage feels to you like, okay, if people go into it with their eyes wide open and realize that this is a model that, kind of fits religion a little bit better or something like that, that's making an informed and an okay choice?
I'll jump in. I would say, first of all, I have no doubt that somebody has been helped by this, because I think people often get help by treatment, basically in therapy. Just going and reaching out for help may be enough of something to help them. So can I say no one's ever been helped? Absolutely not. I'd be shocked if that was actually true. However, I think that's a little bit of the wrong question, because I think what we're looking at is a question of, do we know better ways to do this? And the other part of your question is this harming people? So just because something has helped someone doesn't mean that it's not harming a lot of other people, or that there isn't a better option that could help a lot more people. I do think it has harmed a lot of people. I mean, one of the things about this approach is that it's a very largely a shame-based approach about, it is wrong, you are bad. I don't think a lot of people know this, but I see clients that come in and talk about this, that when they have seen sex addiction therapists, they start with the premise that addicts are liars. You are not going to tell the truth. They use polygraphs to hold them accountable. So they have to take a polygraph sometimes 2 or 3 times a week, because they're saying, we don't trust you. You're not honestly participating in therapy, and we're going to just make you prove to us that you're not a liar. That's shame. And we know, the research clearly shows, shame is not a driver of change. It's not the way to get people to change behavior. So I just think there are a lot of other models that are much more based in supporting people and not harming them. And we know shame harms people dearly. So I don't think the question of has it helped anyone is the right question.
Okay. And so, Kristen, Natasha, do you want to echo, disagree? How would you phrase response?
I do think treatment and just getting help and having a space to maybe say, I feel out of control with my relationship with pornography. I have seen a lot of clients where they have reached out initially to a sex addiction treatment therapist or program. And then what inevitably happens, which is where they end up landing in my office, is they said, I don't think it was the porn. It was all these other things. And so they go to a different level and find treatment for what is discovered through a deeper assessment and diagnosis. I'm always amazed what is revealed of deeper issues presenting. And so I think I agree with what Jay's saying. It's really hard to measure. And I think you'd have a lot of people who have been helped. And I have seen a lot of people that are dedicated and devoted to being volunteers in these programs. But I do think that there's a lot of other methods that can be more effective. But I think getting help can just be helpful.
Terrific. Natasha?
Okay, so I can tell you from my experience, so I'm not a researcher, but this is from working with hundreds of people. My experience has been that the ways that this is helpful to a classic Mormon clientele is that, first of all, it does fit their religious model and values. So one of the spouses, for example, or your teen or whomever is acting in a way that we are uncomfortable with and we see as sin, and the addiction model definitely validates that position. And that can feel very helpful. It can also feel very helpful to have, therefore, after that's validated, an approach that will help you adhere to your values. I mean, that's what they're advertising. It is very helpful, especially for a spouse who feels incredibly betrayed by behavior that oftentimes has been kept secret. There's really no ability to teach people within our culture to be open about these things because you're going to be hurtful. You're breaking the marriage contract. And so these are very shame-based things to begin with. So many, many people keep it secret. Therefore, the spouse is completely sideswiped and feeling betrayed and hurt. So this addiction model helps that spouse, in essence, put all that hurt and direct it towards the addiction and not the spouse, that many times in the rest of the areas of their lives maybe have a very actually good relationship. They parent well together. They may have still good sexual relations together. They may love each other. They do church service together. This is the one area in their life for many people that doesn't compute. So now they can blame the addiction. That feels very helpful. There's what I call confession intimacy. And so now we have this, for the first time, maybe talking about things that have happened, things that have been kept secret, and therefore that invokes a certain amount of intimacy and closeness. And as most of us know, when we're going through something difficult, if it doesn't tear us apart, oftentimes it brings us closer together. So this is now something that we're going to fight together, and we're going to start anew. And there's something very romantic and wonderful, and it can just give everybody a sense of purpose again in the marriage. It also gives you, like I said, a plan. So now we have things that we feel that we do have control over. We're going to control, we're going to put filters on the computer or on the phone. We're going to meet with a therapist, once or twice a week. We're going to go to a group. The spouse goes to the spousal group. All of these, we're going to meet with the bishop on a regular basis. We're going to go through a repentance process. All of these things feel like you're managing something that felt unmanageable before. Now, what I am saying is that although all those things feel helpful, and I think legitimately so because of the structure that we're seeing this problem through, they are actually more damaging in the long run. Because I'll tell you what you also have to buy into if you're going to buy into all of that. You have to buy into the idea that your sexuality is diseased, and diseased for the rest of your life. That it is something you're going to have to manage for the rest of your life.
So just like I'm an alcoholic, and I'll always be an alcoholic, even if 40 years down the road I still have never taken alcohol, I still have to call myself an addict.
That's right.
Yeah, you relate to yourself that way.
That's right. There's also very little, I'm sorry?
I just want to say everything you're saying, I'm like, chills. You are articulating this so incredibly well. So well.
It's tragic to me. It's hard not to cry when I talk about it, because it's 15 years of seeing this.
Yes.
Over and over and over again. The other thing is that we don't even talk about spectrum of behavior. So yes, there is a small amount of the population that I would say behavior has become chronically difficult to manage. Okay, I would say that with my clientele, that has been about 2 to 5% of the people who come to see me for these types of problems. Mm-hmm. This is especially traumatic for me when I see this in our adolescents who are coming in self-identifying as sex or porn addicts for masturbating several times a month, having looked at pornography maybe several times a year. This is extremely common in our culture. The other thing that you have to give up, I guess, if you're going to go through this, is that if you're in a spousal relationship, now one of you becomes really the perpetual good one, and the other one is the perpetual bad one. So the idea of really becoming fluid partners is really a brokenness, because now one of you is buying into the fact, well, you're both buying into the fact that one of you is broken. And then the other thing that happens in good intimacy work and sexual and relationship work is that nobody really talks about sexual wants, needs, or desires. And again, usually it's the higher libido partner, and stereotypically the men, that are really basically told your sexual desires, needs, wants, fantasies, whatever, are not valid. So I guess that's my organization of the problem.
You, through all of this, that, which was amazing, it's a male problem. What I see are men and the support structure around them, and the heroing and the championing of reaching out and getting help. And when I have worked with the sex addiction treatment centers, as you divide up into your two groups, the women are going into groups as the victims or the codependents or the traumatized, and the men are all the addicts. And I see that as a big problem, that this is very gender biased. At least in Utah, I can't speak to the clinics outside of Utah, but there's some predominant ones in Utah where you are divided by gender, and you, I know for a fact when women identify as the high libido partner and the men are the low desire partner, and they're looking at porn for a variety of reasons, but the women, there's not a place for them to discuss what that dynamic looks like. It's very one-dimensional, one dynamic, and gender biased as I see it as well.
I agree. I think it's everywhere. It's identified as a male problem, and I mean, let's face it. The perspective is, if a man wants more sex, there's something wrong with him. If a woman wants more sex, the man's lucky, right? You hear it all the time. Well, you're a lucky guy that your wife wants that much sex. You don't hear it the other direction.
Very interesting.
And even Doug Braun Harvey and Michael Vigorito, who have written the book on treating out of control behavior, sexual behavior. Although I hate the name, I love their book, and I told them that. But they very clearly state that, you know, when women start coming in telling us that they feel like they're out of control with their sexual behavior, we'll be able to develop a treatment model for them. This really is a treatment model that they've developed for males, and it's not because they've sought out males. But we have taught males to think of themselves as over-sexualized beings, and so therefore if their libidos don't match with their wives, and this very much fits into Mormon culture, where men are constantly told how they need to control the natural man, control their appetites, control their passions, their lusts, their desires, which, granted, they should do because that goes into consent. But the way we teach it very much promotes this idea that if you're male, you're somehow going to be out of control with your behavior. And we very much give a very different message to girls about guarding themselves from men's naughty appetites. So you can see a lot of that self-fulfilling prophecies that, and how the addiction model, in a sense, very much fits into that and causes, I think, much more harm than good. And we're just starting to see some research on that. Thank goodness. We're starting to see some research where it's not just me anecdotally saying, hey, I've seen hundreds of people where this is not helpful and actually harmful. Now there's some data to back that up.
Thank you. And if you guys want to go more into the gendered stuff, let's do it right now. Otherwise, I have 3 related questions that are going to a little bit be in the religion area. Okay. So, but anybody want to do anything more on the gender and, sexuality as a disease or must be controlled and how that messes things up?
I think Natasha did a fantastic job. The only thing I will say on that line is, again, we don't have a path when I worked with adolescent females who went and confessed to their bishop that they were struggling with pornography and the discomfort there. And what ended up happening to that woman, or to the she was a very young woman, feeling very dismissed, not heard, and then really felt stuck. She had nowhere to go, but there was no help for her. And I see that as a harmful thing for many, because again, it's this idea that the boys are sexual and the girls are not, and all the messaging we've heard around that could go down an entirely different rabbit hole.
Yes, terrific. Jay, anything more on any of that gendered stuff?
I think they covered it well.
All right, Mormon Matters, that's our podcast. Let's talk about some things that I think, Mormonism comes into place here, or at least that spiritual calling and that sense that somebody can have, that this is mission driven, that I'm gonna champion this way or that or the other thing. So the first thing I want to kind of pick up on is maybe just to add something, Natasha, to your, I agree with Kristen, wonderful way of just going down all these different things. And this comes from me from a podcast we did about 3 years ago with mid-signals, people who were, in their 30s and things in the church. And one of the women was it was powerful to me, and it was difficult to hear her story. But one of the things that she was saying is all this talk in Mormonism about porn and how it's endemic and things like this, she had a skewed perception of all men as probably porn addicts, and she felt like that made men scarier to her. That made her more unwilling to want to have anything that would move her into a relationship. Somehow or other, before the first date, she would almost want to know if they'd ever looked at porn even once. Those kinds of things. And I'm exaggerating here, but something in that, it's this overabundance of talk about porn as addiction and is so endemic as an addiction can truly skew perceptions of people about each other. Is that a good enough by itself? Or Natasha or Kristen, would you want to talk about that within Mormonism too?
Well, I guess I would say that there is something incredibly important in understanding the power of suggestion. And we see this a lot in how we're talking about boys, how we're talking about sexuality to boys and girls from a very early age. And the message is not only that we find in Mormonism, but in our culture without. And that the data doesn't really necessarily support a whole lot of difference between men and women. Yes, there are obviously differences. We have different anatomy and there's different hormonal makeups and things of that nature. But brain mapping tends to be pretty similar. And there's just we're not quite as Venus and Marsy as we'd like to think we are, and yet we have very strict gender roles around sexuality for boy, I mean, I don't know where not to find that in our history, of the human race. And maybe this goes back to even our op-ed and why we felt it so important to talk about this with our teens, getting information that is so dramatic and misinformed. Because when you tell, a vulnerable audience that if you do a certain thing, you will then become a certain thing, that has a lot of power of suggestion. And I think I see that a lot in our Mormon couples. I mean, do most people have, an occurrence of having viewed porn? Actually, that the numbers on that these days is pretty high. Most people have probably seen some type of pornographic image, or maybe have even revisited it to manage libido or things like that, especially in adolescence, or, when you're not married, kind of like what Nikki was talking about in conjunction with masturbation. But we have this sense in Mormonism where any sexuality outside of a marriage relationship is so heinous and so demonized that then all of these types of things do elicit fear, do elicit mistrust, and you start off a relationship almost like opponents instead of partners. And wow, that's a pretty rough thing to be doing to our young people, just because we can't manage our own sexual anxieties.
The piece, I guess, I kind of was thinking when Natasha was talking was the messaging that adolescents are getting, and something that I think a lot about is the development around our sexual agency. And as I really delve deeply into studying what sexual agency is, a lot of people hear that and go, okay, wait, are you just saying if we're going to teach our kids sexual agency, it's a free-for-all? I'm like, no, not at all. But in other areas, as we're teaching agency, it's the prime component of our gospel. We're helping kids develop their agency so as they form and develop their character, they have legs to stand on as they grow and develop and move through these developmental stages. When it comes to sexuality, it's handed to children on a platter. When you are born, you will be heterosexual. You won't masturbate. This will be your gender, and this is the appropriate gender expression. I could go on and on, but really, there's no development, first of all, and there's no opportunity. The components of agency is to understand the choice in there and to learn and develop and to, again, choose the value-based, choose the right. Well, when you have zero development around understanding your sexuality, understanding the way your body responds to sexual stimuli is normal and means your body is working, and have the space to answer questions and understand age-appropriate material, by the time you hit 12 or 13 or 14 and you are confronted with more challenging sexual circumstances, you have no idea how to navigate it. You don't know what your body's doing. You don't know the questions to ask. You don't know who to ask them to. And I think that's really sad. And no wonder porn right now is scary for most people, because we're not teaching children how to navigate their sexuality in healthy ways. And so these initial messages, like Natasha was saying, like fight the new drug, if this is their first exposure to an honest sexual relationship, which, let me pull back that word, if this is their first exposure to a sexual relationship, I don't think this is the conversation to be having. I think we really need to go back a lot of steps, and I see this also happening within our church culture, is conversations are needing to start, but the adolescents are the most vulnerable. I see parents really comfortable talking to kids about anatomy and answering the basic birds and the bees, but once their kids develop into sexual beings, so let's just say puberty, 10, 11, whatever, and on, then it's like nothing. It's kind of radio silence. And so then we have messaging around, we have scary messages. Porn can overtake you. Your sexuality is very scary. It can get out of control. Girls, you have to be on guard. Boys, watch out. And that's the messages adolescents are getting. And then, of course, those are going to carry over into your marital relationship and into adulthood if you're single and otherwise.
Fantastic. Jay, outside of Mormonism, are you seeing that skewing because of the language about porn as far as how people might be mistrustful of others, etc.?
Yeah, I do. I think it's certainly prevalent in a lot of areas. As I was listening to this, and I think about it as listening to both of them discuss it, is, I was raised in a Christian household. I had a grandfather that was a minister, uncle that was a minister. And the Christianity I was raised in was really focused on compassion and forgiveness and acceptance and not shame and criticism. And what I hear in all these approaches to sex and sexuality is tons of shame. You're a bad person if you do this. You're going to go to hell. There is no compassion around this with people. And I think it starts right out with the scare tactics of telling, teaching young people, and then I think you're right, once you actually become a sexual being, just creating so much shame and fear around it. I have trouble understanding how that stems from a Christian perspective, but that's what I see, I think, in a lot of religions, is that very shaming of approach to all of this.
Yeah. And I guess that almost ties back a little bit to, and I'm not trying to be an apologist for where the Mormon Church is or where, many religious groups are for this, but that, the old model, the addiction model seemed ready-made for this particular thing. And you guys are now saying the data doesn't do that. It does more harm than good, etc. And there's an adjustment period that I think is understandable, where it begins to be more like this really needs to be focused, is when people really need to look at their motives. Why am I holding on to this model? Is it for my financial gain? Is it the fact that I set up my business or this? Or is it because I am afraid, and then when it comes to the client, is it because I'm afraid to look at the deeper, more the needs that this is fulfilling from me, and if I can get whole there, that's a lot of work, and I'm afraid of that. So are you guys at all comfortable with the fact that this is an understandable lag in between the science and where religions are right now? Because, like, for instance, Natasha, I do want to go next into the church uses this model for their addiction and recovery program. Do you believe that they've actually been taught by people like you that this is a more harmful model, and here's why? Could they have heard your litany of things about why you said it was more harmful and things, or are they just working out of, somebody told me this and therefore it fits my model and I haven't really explored yet?
Well, I'm going to try to hit on several points. So one is that I think that it's very difficult, like I said, if it's difficult for professionals and if it's difficult for the public, of course it's going to be difficult for religious leaders as well to be able to parse out through all this information. And we all know that we have confirmation bias, so it's just easier and it makes sense to kind of go with the professional opinion that matches the religious, I guess, process, right? And I definitely see that happening. I felt that way as well. I felt that way for several years. I wasn't trained necessarily. I didn't go through the training to become a sex addiction therapist, but I definitely was using their model. And it was through using it that I started to see how it just didn't work. And it really was a challenging process for myself to have to fight that confirmation bias. It was not an easy process. So I actually have quite a bit of empathy for those on the other side, who maybe see me as an enemy right now. I'm not trying to be an enemy. I'm just saying this isn't working and we're harming. And I don't think most professionals or religious leaders want to harm. But I think it goes really back to something that Nikki Prousey said about the abstinence model. And I think that it's going to take a lot for our church to get away from basically the asexual abstinence model till marriage type of approach. And if that's really the expectation, that I think the asexual population is actually somewhere around 2 or 3%. You're welcome to challenge that, other therapists in the room. But then that means that like over 90% of us are failing at that in some way or another, whether we're masturbating or looking at erotic films or having premarital sex or other premarital sexual activities. Most members of the church are failing at that in one way or another. And what I have found to be very successful, and I think what we would say is a common goal, which is to reduce problematic sexual behavior, or to at least adhere to your religious values as much as possible, is to not take an abstinence-only approach, to really normalize sexuality. And so seeing masturbation as a possible option, seeing certain types of sexuality in premarital relationships as certain options where people can feel empowered to make those decisions on their own. And this is something that I think Mormons are extremely uncomfortable with. And anytime I even mention it, it's, I'm quite vilified. I mean, my most vilifying thing I've ever done to my career working within Mormonism is to say that masturbation is a normative behavior, and I do not believe that in of itself it's a sinful practice. So that shifted my entire career as a Mormon therapist, something that, the Pediatric Association, for example, has been saying for years. And the leaders of the church know that that's the stance of the Pediatric Association, or they should know.
Do they?
If they're gonna,
yeah, okay.
Well, if they're going to talk about sex as often as they do, if they don't, I think that's immoral.
Well, we just had leaks of these briefings, and I'm not positive that everything comes up in the briefing. There's people that choose what they present and what they don't present, and so do they really know the Pediatric Association would be saying this and things like that?
Well, I think that there have been doctors that are part of our leadership that would know that. And I am more than happy to be briefed at any point. I have offered my services on various occasions.
Yes. Yeah, I got to think it's going to start entering the consciousness at a greater level because of the stuff that you guys are doing right now. But it's not quite there yet. Kristen.
So I do, like Natasha's saying, I do empathize. Something that is always surprising to people is you have therapists all over the country, and there is zero requirement for any therapist to have gone through any sort of sex education class. It's not required. But everyone that's going in to see those therapists is a sexual being. So by default, in a sense, we're all sex therapists. In Utah right now, there's 5 certified sex therapists, which means we studied sex. Those are the therapists.
And you don't consider the Carnes certification of sex addiction therapists as in this category?
No.
The way I see that is you've learned how to unclog a toilet, but you never were taught plumbing. And you need to really understand plumbing to be able to look at the deeper issues. And so I don't see it as a form of sex, as training in sexuality.
Okay, so five certified folks. Okay.
But my bigger point with that is then take a country that there's no sex education happening, and homes where sex isn't talked about. So you have clergy, and you have therapists, and you have counselors, and you have parents that have not had any training or discussion, basic to in-depth training around sexuality. And that's a big problem, but yet we are regulating sexuality like crazy. We are commenting on it. We are enforcing policies and rules, and yet there's very little training in this. I do know down at BYU in the counseling program, they are piloting a different program approaching compulsive behaviors around pornography. They're trying the ACT model, the acceptance and commitment therapy model. So they are trying something new. And I do think the church has the capacity. We are excellent at doing trainings. We can whip out a training and hold giant leadership councils and disseminate information. We have the channels in place. It's if, like what Natasha is saying, we are comfortable in making the switch and changing how we're discussing sexuality. When I've gone and done presentations in my ward and stake, which I'm so grateful they let me and trust me, but I have yet to be able to do a presentation where we're talking to our kids about sex, but I can do talking to your kids about porn. And what inevitably happens is through the discussion around talking to your kids about porn, they all have questions about how to talk to your kids about sex, because you really can't have one without the other. Mm-hmm. You can't, like what the Fight the New Drug is saying in that op-ed, we're just teaching about porn. Well, you can't talk about porn without sex. What you can have is a discussion around healthy sexuality, and porn is a part of it.
That is the most, by the way, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that is the most mind-warping thing. I don't even know how to make sense of the idea that teaching about pornography is not teaching about sexuality. How in the heck they have come up with that loophole is mind-blowing to me. I'm sorry.
Right. No, so that's it. So I get why there's not an awareness here, because again, sexuality isn't something that it's a social justice issue. People aren't having access to accurate age-appropriate information across the lifespan. And so, yes, these leaders aren't having information, and these therapists are shooting at the hip. We're all treating from our own experience or what we've been taught, but that doesn't mean it's based on fact or the healthiest approach, and should be what we are teaching.
Wonderful. Jay, do you want to jump in at all with anything in that quick area of a lag time in the community and society, etc.? Has that lag time for you completely worn out, or is there still sort of like, okay, I understand that education is still needed for the next 10 years, and in other words, you guys are still the minority position working out there today. Is that excusable still because of just simply the time?
Yes, no, maybe. How's that?
Nice.
I agree with what they said. I understand why it is. What's frustrating for me is that there are now voices speaking up, and the level of pushback that it's getting. For example, I think just what they were talking about in terms of this not being sex or sexuality education, this just being porn education. This was put in the face that, hey, this is about sex and sexuality, and there wasn't a willingness to say, hey, maybe we need to look at that. Let's talk about that. It was just dismissed as, oh no, this is just about porn. And I do think but it is true that it starts with therapists who we don't get great training in this. I feel fortunate that I went to a grad school that required one human sexuality course, which was mediocre at best, but it was more than most therapists I know. And so there just isn't a good basis for therapists. If we
and Jay and I were both trained in marriage and family therapy, and I think that's why we got that one human sexuality class, because I had one as well.
And so it doesn't surprise me that there's a lag time, but I think there needs to be a willingness to say, hey, we're hearing some things. I'll share one really quick anecdote. When in my grad school program, there was a gentleman who had a doctor of divinity, had been pastor of a very large church for years and years, had done pastoral counseling. He wanted to get actual therapy training. And I remember he got up in front of the class to do a presentation, and he said, I want to start with this. In all my years of doing pastoral counseling, I have come to one realization, and that would really change the way we do therapy. If people would just understand that sex is not important, we'd have a lot less problems and a lot better relationships. There was like an audible gasp at that thought. But that's the mentality of some people. And when we have that pervasive thought out there, there is going to be a battle of getting, in a time lag and getting people to understand this.
Thank you.
Well, and to really quick, I'm sorry, Dan, there was one part of your question that I didn't answer, and I know we had lunch a few months ago where I kind of called you out on your podcast about sex addiction, and I was like, oh, Dan, why didn't you call me on that?
Well, again, I didn't organize that one. That was sort of a series, and it did come through people that had been exposed and working within the church's addiction recovery program, as well as groups and retreatment, clinics and things like that work out of that model. And so,
right. And so that was exactly the point. We had a great discussion about that. And, this couple that you interviewed, that that I thought, they were kind of a really good example. Like, I totally empathized with them. I totally understood where they were coming from. I totally got why they felt like this was a really helpful approach, which was a lot of what I spoke about earlier in the podcast right now. And yet, I will answer very clearly that no, I do not agree with the church using the 12-step program to deal with sexuality. I don't agree with it for all the many reasons that we've seen here. And I can't tell you how many, again, of my teenagers in particular get referred to those types of programs, especially prior to a mission, because they have masturbated sometimes once or twice in the last, 3 or 4 months. And they're getting, again, that power of suggestion, being told that they are a sexual addict and that their ability to serve the Lord and serve a mission due to this behavior is, it's in jeopardy.
Can't feel the Spirit. You're bad, sick, and wrong. Oh, so such a difficult thing, and so we'll just hope for that shift. There's one last piece of religion before I want to get into compulsivity and what it suggests, high sex drive, social shame model, and play in that area. And this last thing is just simply the call that many people feel, and especially religious people, feel to have mission, to have a purpose, that there's when you feel like you have something and you're fighting against something that is harmful, and certainly we know that there are cases in which pornography truly does harm, and so that gives you that basis in your life to say, I'm going to pick this cause, I'm going to pick this thing to be a champion, and that way I'm showing my love for God, that way I'm showing my love for humanity, and I want to honor this genuine religious call there, and yet sort of wrestle with, you can feel that and still be completely wrong in your approach. In other words, admire the zeal, but on the other hand, we know that zealots can be wrong as well. How do you guys honor, or do you at all fight the new drug, Sons of Helaman that you mentioned, Natasha, who I don't know about, or things like this, as sort of people acting out what they feel is a religious mission?
Yeah, I think I would just second what I said earlier. I mean, the CEO of Fight the New Drug, for example, I think is pretty clear that he comes from a position where he felt this was a problem in his life, and whatever he feels helped him is how he's trying to help other people. And he's Mormon, and I have no idea of the specifics of what he's talking about there, but I would imagine a lot of what we're talking about here may apply to his life. So again, I don't see it as a malicious thing. The Sons of Helaman to me is just reading through their website. I don't even have to look at some of their videos, which are even more disturbing, but just looking at their website is just unethical practice. So all of us as mental health professionals are trained in ethics, all of us. And in order to maintain a license, we have to do 2 things. We need to follow the code of ethics of our profession, which each profession has a pretty similar code of ethics, and we need to be following the rules of the licensing department of each state. Each state in our country regulates the therapists in their state, and part of that code of ethics is to be able to check your own biases. It's just a very basic thing of being able to be a therapist.
But do they understand religious worldview as a bias, or do they just understand that as the truth of the universe?
Well,
yeah.
I believe that every ethics class absolutely includes your own religious bias. But if you can't get past that, because of course you're a member of the one and only true church,
right,
so everybody else should check their religious bias except for me,
yeah,
then you're practicing.
You're going where I wanted you to go. Good. Yeah.
I think it's reportable. I think it's reportable to the state license board.
Wow, interesting. And Kristen and Jay, on, is there any kudos you can give to somebody that feels this so strongly, and yet, how do you, let's say that then one of these people came and they're your client. How do you walk them back from this where they can honor something good and yet completely change their perspective towards it?
Well, let me start off by saying that I feel like Sons of Helaman's even in a different realm and category than Fight the New Drug.
Okay.
I don't know
I
about
have
you,
no clue what
Natasha,
they're about. So
they're really.
I agree. And let me just make a distinction too, and I'll let Kristen go for it and Jay. But there's a difference between trained professionals, which we're held to a certain standard, Fight the New Drug, which in itself as to why they're allowed to train our kids, but they're not professionals in the field of mental health.
Yeah. So do I think there's kudos? I'm very clear. It's not my job to change everybody. As a therapist, you're always taught to meet people where they're at. I'm very clear if someone comes to me of wanting help with, if they self-identify as a sex addict or a porn addict, I have them break down what that means to them. And if they're passionate about it, we keep talking about it. And I will say, if you are wanting me to approach this from an addiction standpoint or treat this as an addiction where we're checking in on your sexual behavior each week and we're putting you into 12-step, I'm not the therapist for you. And I've had majority of clients feel very relieved at that, some that were intrigued and wanted to know more, and just a few that were like, okay, I'd like to be referred elsewhere. I also find that to be a part of my ethical responsibilities as a therapist. And so if someone is passionately there, then they're seed planting. I look at where I was on this issue even 5 years ago, and it's been a process. And it started with me reading David Lay's book, The Myth of Sex Addiction, at the same time as Patrick Carnes' book, Out of the Shadows, because I was so confused. I read these two books simultaneously and had questions with these authors, and it helped me really start to get a grip on, I don't see this as a sex addiction. So if someone is passionately that this is their cause, I could have been in that same boat 7 years ago. And then over time and through experience and dialogue and information and education, my position has changed quite a bit. So is there room for that? Sure. And what you're seeing is Natasha and I now sharing our same passion, but just on a different side of it now.
do you feel it as a spiritual call to do this?
I feel like being able to talk about sexuality is a spiritual call, yes.
Well, and like Kristen has said, it's a social justice issue. And I do think that Kristen and I both agree that we feel very much a passion for that.
Okay, terrific. Jay, anything in this realm of recognizing that they sort of feel, some vertical connection, some sort of, higher power or something calling in their life and saying, champion this. And then, even when you're wrong, that wrestle that could happen about the confusion over why did I feel such passion? Why did I sense it was from God? And yet I was completely wrong.
Well, I would suggest that they differentiate between the cause and the method. Because I don't think that, I think there are a lot of people who are right, that they are concerned about people who have issues around their sexual practices and their sexuality. Absolutely true. We almost all agree on that. That doesn't mean that this is the only way to address it. Your calling can be, I want to help people who are struggling with this. We're just saying there's multiple ways to do that, and we think there are better ways to do that. So is the calling to do sex addiction work? Or is the calling to help people who are struggling with issues of sex and sexuality, and then figuring out what the best way to approach that is? That would be my response to that. Yes. I think they're mixing up the two things.
And Jay, I agree with that. That I think I think Clay and our intentions. Clay is the CEO of Fight the New Drug. Mm-hmm. I think if we were to sit down and have a conversation and say, "What's your ultimate goal?" Well, to have happy, healthy, sexually healthy kids and adults. And we would all say, yeah, we want the same thing. Right. And the ways that we feel passionate and the ways to go about that are dramatically different. I think that's a really important point that you just hit on, Jay.
Yeah. I don't discount their ultimate goal at all. It is the way they're doing it that's problematic.
Beautiful.
And I would suggest if anybody feels that calling, that they ask that question of themselves. What is it that I'm really feeling the calling?
Beautiful. I love that. That was a super good answer. Okay, here's where I feel like I want to go. Nikki offered 3 alternatives to the addiction model, and I want to spend some time with each of those. And if you guys thought of other ones than the 3 that she mentioned, she mentioned looking at it as a compulsion and treating it as a compulsion, and when you do it like a food compulsion or something, abstinence from all food is not the goal there, but sort of a management and an understanding your motives that lead to compulsive behaviors. Then she talked about therapies and approaches for folks who have high sex drive, high libido. And then she talks about the social shame model and how to work within that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about each of those, and then you guys can add any extras. Is that an okay plan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so compulsion is certainly the one that I had been most familiar with before. Maybe Kristen, I'll just have you start out. When you now sit with somebody, is compulsion generally what you sense is going on? And if so, what's the sort of way that you approach that?
And this may be where Jay and Natasha come in, because the majority of my clients, it's actually not a compulsion. They have a history of unaddressed child sexual abuse. They have undiagnosed and untreated anxiety and self-esteem and self-worth. So I guess the compulsive, we'd have to really break that down, because these are people that are masturbating once a week, once a day. And I still look at that and go, is that compulsive? Right. So let's get clear on what we're identifying and defining as a compulsion.
Okay, so thank you. So when you say those who have suffered abuse or had some real pathology built up around sexuality from life experiences, would that be a 4th category that we should talk about separately?
Well, Nikki talked about the social shame model,
right?
Which
and
I
so
think
would that be the most? Yeah, let's go with what Kristen started us down, rather than worry about going compulsivity right now. So let's go for it.
Well, so let me frame it, and then I'll let Kristen and Jay kind of go for it, because this is just a simple way that I have kind of come up with what types of problems there are. And this is my language, because we're all a little bit conflicted, even amongst those who agree on what to call these different things. So I have one category, and I call it problematic. There's problematic sexual behavior. And this for me means that a person might be acting in ways that goes against their own values, like religious moral codes. We've talked about that. Maybe it doesn't meet the expectations of how the society or culture expects them to act. So there's problems in that regard. We see that a lot with even LGBTQ population. Maybe it impedes upon a relational sexual contracts. In other words, my partner isn't necessarily happy with my behavior or doesn't want to do the behavior I want to do, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be problematic for a variety of reasons. It's causing problems in your life. What you want to do and what you are doing and how you feel about it or how others feel about it, there's a conflict in there somehow. Then I put the second category as being maladaptive. And this is maybe where we can talk about compulsivity. So meaning that now the behavior has become such a focus in the person's life that it's interfering with the quality of their daily living. So these are the people who maybe are looking at pornography for hours at work and taking the risk of getting fired, or finances are being misconstrued because, they're soliciting sex workers or spending tons of money on sexual events, or there's time management issues, or, heavy duty social ramifications or relational ramifications that, and this is where you get a lot of people saying, yeah, I do feel out of control. And when you really assess and ask about the amount of time and the amount of energy, it does seem out of balance. It's creating a problem. And then the third category that I put sexuality in is criminal, which is really where you have coercion or non-consensual practices, boundary crossing violence, etc. Now, the addiction model, as we've talked about, doesn't help any of these. And the one that it helps the least is the criminal one, because we now see people having less amounts of time in jail or in prison because their lawyers are using this idea that, well, they're a sex addict, they can't really help themselves. There's not this idea of responsibility and one's sexual decision. So that's probably where it's most harmful. And I think we've talked about how it's harmful in the other ways as well. So that's my framing of how you can run into problems with sexual behavior. And maybe now the other two can take it away on what we do about those things.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, Kristen, Jay, either of you want to start in on, like, here's my approach when I've diagnosed it or when my sense is this is the problem.
Jay, why don't you take it away? Because I'm interested in your perspective.
I was interested in hearing how Natasha divided it up, and I don't know that I differentiate between the first two groups. To me, I just see it all as problematic behavior, and that's kind of the thing. I don't categorize it so much. If somebody comes in and they said this is causing me a problem, I don't automatically assume that the answer is that we want to stop it. I want to dig into finding out why it's causing a problem, in what way, and why is that the activity that is being driven by whatever it is that's at the core of things. And so, it is for me really. I come from an approach that we call experiential within marriage and family therapy. It's really about getting people in touch with their feelings and emotions, understanding how those integrate into their life, making sense of them, having tools to manage those. And I would say the vast majority of people that I see are coming in for one of two. If I was to categorize it, say one of two reasons. It's a self-soothing thing, so they just want to feel better for a minute because they're not feeling good. So the issue is digging into why they're not feeling good and sorting that out. Or some conflict. It's like a moral conflict or values conflict, or either with them or relationship, So I just take that pile that I think that Natasha had and sift it a little differently, but it's really digging into what's driving this. What is the benefit they're getting out of the behavior? What problem is it solving for them? And then looking at, is that just a way of, we can use coping strategies. There are coping strategies that work, but aren't the best coping strategies, right? Alcohol, good example. It's effective in its way. It has a lot of negative downsides. So what is the thing that is causing somebody to decide they need to have a drink? And how can we either implement other strategies or help them understand that the way they're doing this maybe isn't really problematic? Because that's the two ways this can go, right? There was a discussion about people who say, well, I masturbate once a month and that's a problem. Well, maybe it's a shift in perspective to believe that that's not actually a problem. Or I'm masturbating so much I'm missing work and I'm getting fired. Okay, what is the problem, and what can we put in place to have you do to address that problem, or how do we resolve that problem so that doesn't need to occur? Or that's really a rough cut at my approaches of this. I haven't dealt a lot with the criminal side of it. I've had a couple people related to that, but even there, it is helping people understand what it is that drove them to them in the first place. I have not run into anybody who the answer has just been, I want this so badly I can't stop myself. It has always been the result of something else. I have seen people who have been married for 40 plus years, and after 38 years they had an affair, and their wife or partner decided they were a sex addict because they had an affair after 38 years of monogamy, when in reality this person was in a high-stress job which was completely going down the tubes, had been so focused on work, didn't have any support system, didn't have anybody to turn to, was feeling so bad about himself, and had such low self-esteem. It was a coping mechanism. He felt it let him feel good about himself for a little bit. Had nothing to do with not caring about his wife. It had nothing to do with wanting sex. It had to do with, I feel crappy. I have no supports in place for myself. And this opportunity presented itself where somebody wanted me, and that felt good. And so for me, it's just always about digging in about what's really going on and what's driving the behavior and addressing that. And that almost always results in the problem, I'm using air quotes as we speak, going away.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, sort of more get healthy, get in touch with yourself and stuff like that. You guys are finding that these behaviors go away without necessarily making too much of a focus on behavioral strategies.
Well,
Absolutely.
I don't know if it's going away or people's behaviors and values come closer into alignment, or there's shame reduction, because that could go into the whole idea that people have stopped masturbating once they uncover it. And so the behavior piece, I think people develop a healthier relationship with their sexuality that's not flooded in shame.
Yes. And I think sometimes it means that behavior lessens just because they've dealt with the issue that was driving them to it. And other times it doesn't lessen, they just become okay with it. They deal with the shame around it. It depends on the situation.
Yes.
Right. Like if you're masturbating once every 6 months, maybe your values shift. If you're having affairs on your spouse, maybe the behavior shifts.
Right.
Or you have difficult conversations with your spouse to readjust what's going on in your relationship.
And be honest about what you are or are not really willing to commit to, which is very difficult conversations. That's getting real with each other.
Yeah. Now, go ahead.
Sorry, just real quickly, add one more thing is when I sometimes run into situations where the conflict is just about like the activity, like somebody has a certain sexual interest and the partner doesn't, and then they get labeled as a sex addict because they want to do weird things, and again, weird in air quotes. And so sometimes there's been strategies where you figure out what it is that the person's looking for, what the dynamic of that thing is, and we find other approaches to get that desire fulfilled in what I have kind of coined the term relationship safe ways. So finding ways that works with both partners gets that dynamic fulfilled for the one in a way that's not in conflict with the other. So there's a lot of different strategies you can use with it.
And this goes back to really such a pivotal part of what we're talking about and why we feel so deeply about this is that correct diagnosis and assessment, whether it's mental health diagnosis or relational assessment, is so pivotal to getting results that really are sustainable, ongoing, and really help people move towards healthy sexuality versus just, oh yeah, there's an addiction and let's put you through that program. And really you're not doing any of the work that we're talking about here, or very little of it.
Yeah.
It becomes more about behavior management or behavior modification instead of unpacking everything.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on.
Good stuff. I'm debating. I want to bring an element into this, and I'm not sure the right spot, but I'm just going to go for it here. I've got 3 therapists here, and I agree that the type of the work that you're doing is vital, and people need to get in touch with these things, the stuff that's covered over that they maybe aren't understanding the deeper reasons for driving it. Now, so there's 3 therapists there. I'm Jay, I don't know if you know, I have a doctorate in religion, and it's religion theology, and in many ways, my career has been more like unofficially as a pastor, within Mormonism, even though not officially in the way that you're doing it. But I kind of serve that pastor role, and plus I'm kind of a mystical guy. I tend to have had some powerful sort of connections. I think with some really interesting and powerful energies. And so what I've been looking for in all of this is a way to break into the question of we can see that there's religion and certain ideas, and so the addiction model fits certainly in there. I'm looking for the positive things that religion has to offer, or that spirituality has to offer, that could either be, maybe you guys can't ethically bring it into your process, but maybe you can at least speak to it as people with either religious backgrounds, or at least having worked with people that see, oh yes, some kind of connection with God, some kind of transformative experience where they truly do, they're able to shed guilt and shame because of some powerful experience of God's love for them, or something along those lines. So I guess I'm trying to say, where can you guys look in religion, either as as something that could be helpful in creating this wholeness that would then let these behaviors dissipate and move out of those problematic realms. So anyone want to try that?
I'd love to hear from the non-Mormon first.
Okay.
I'm going to have a really short, quick answer, and I'll be done. Compassion, love, and forgiveness.
So those are religious thoughts, yes.
They should be, I believe, embraced by religion, and they should be applied to people who are suffering. And I think that is often missed in the approaches to this, is there isn't a lot of compassion being shown. There's a lot of shaming and making people feel bad and telling them they're not good people. And that's just not an invitation to change or to work or to improve. And I think when we have compassion, when we have, are willing to forgive people, that incentivizes them to do the work that they want to do, to become the people they want to become.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about the mystical piece? And again, just you're the non-Mormon here, but that sense of somebody I'm not saying they should bypass therapy. They should bypass the cognitive understanding, of what's going on with them. But the folks that a powerful religious experience of love or grace or something like that, is that something that with certain clients you might be willing to help promote?
Absolutely. I utilize where people are, what their religious beliefs are. My job is not to tell them how to practice their religion. And if they draw upon that as a support, if they believe that that's part of what helps them be who they are, whatever way we can use it, I'm on board with them leveraging what works for them. I will often, I will ask people what their religious and spiritual perspectives are, and really try to work hard within that framework for them to find ways to do the work that both resonates with their values in religion, but also allows them to draw upon whatever strength and support they get from their religion, their higher power, whatever it is for that person.
Awesome. Thank you. Natasha and Kristen, general religious concepts or resources that seem helpful. And partly, I guess I want to say, if there's LDS therapists who have been practicing out of the addiction, model, and it's because they're looking at particular scriptures or particular angles on stuff. I want to lift up these other positive things within religion, within Mormonism, etc., that could help them make that shift to perhaps these more healthy therapeutic approaches.
So someone I would recommend, she's who, this is when clients want to pull in religion and or spirituality. It's some of my favorite intersection. Like, I love the intersection of sexuality and spirituality. And I differentiate between religion and spirituality, and have them kind of explore that if that's where they'd like to go. But Gina Ogden is a mystical. She's a shaman, or not, she's not a shaman, but she's studied under shamanism. And what a lot of her work has been is to pull back in the spirituality. And in Salt Lake, we just had the Rocky Mountain Sex Summit, where we had a research scientist and a spiritual person to combine these two ideas. But Gina Ogden's work is very, very spiritual and pulls in these other elements and allows people to look at their sexuality through emotional, mental, spiritual, and physical, and then integrate all of them. And I love it when people will wrestle with God with their spirituality. When I've asked people, well, have you brought this to God? And they'll say, well, no. Because a lot of people think sex is something that we do, not who we are. And I love talking about it. Again, this is all like what Jay was saying. If this is where they want to go and pulling from where they're leading this, but inviting them to include God into their sexuality is a very exciting prospect, because I do feel like sexuality is by divine design and is far more complex than we like to package it up, which to me is exciting and positive. And there's a lot of room within Mormon doctrine to build on that, a lot of room. We just have to be willing to see it and go there to the more spiritual realm and not just limit it to the religious.
But one of the takeaway here is, if the client seems to want to go into that area,
I never bring it in. It's where people want to go. Those ideas would be more in my book. When it comes to therapy, I don't have religious symbols. I have people, I'm a blank slate, because I feel like that's what good therapy is allowing a client, you're on their agenda. And like Jay is saying, wherever their values are, to work within their value system, and help them be their healthiest.
But if they're using symbols from their system that reinforce something in a way that doesn't seem helpful to you, does that give you permission to say, well, here's also a symbol within your general religion that maybe you ought to concentrate on this one more, or at least would you consider this?
It depends. I would never say you should concentrate on this more, but I may have them explore that symbol and delve more deeply around it. What's the meaning they attach to it? Where was that meaning introduced? How do they feel about it? And first, really get to know what they have put around that symbol.
I would say,
okay, please, Jay.
I would second that I would never tell somebody what they should or shouldn't do, but I would challenge them to think about one, or ask them, well, I also know about this from your religion. How does that fit with this? And there's a big difference between putting things in front of people and asking them to think about it, challenging them. There's a big difference between that and telling them what they should think.
And I even recognized it was coming out of my mouth, you should concentrate on this. And that's why I added something a little bit after that was a little more open-ended, but I caught that as it was escaping my mouth there. Natasha, talk about that if you would. Mormonism, Christianity, spirituality. Think of the therapist working out of this other model, and you're trying to be less scary with proposing these alternatives and things like that, and maybe they want to really, this is a religious calling to them as well as a work, their vocation.
Well, it is absolutely ethical to include people's spirituality and religious experiences within the therapeutic framework, as both Kristen and Jay have mentioned. It is not ethical to bring our own or to impose our own. And so, therefore, the question, if I need to enter that office as if God may or may not exist, regardless of whether or not he, she exists for me. And so, and I've seen this mistake by a lot of what I would call Christian counselors, people I've done co-therapy with, or people I've seen some of their practice just through some of the trainings that we do, but where they'll say, well, how do you think God feels about that, without the client ever having said that they believed in God? And so we need to be very, very careful as mental health professionals to not cross those types of, again, unethical boundaries. And even if we do believe in God, your God may be very different from my God, right?
So
as far as how we conceptualize.
Yeah. Is it ethical for a treatment center, let's say, to say the treatments here are based upon XYZ, but it is within the framework of this tradition? And if you announce that at first, does that violate the ethical quandary there?
Yeah, I think that's up for debate. I mean, a lot of people advertise themselves as Christian counselors. I call myself the Mormon therapist. There's something obviously culturally competent about the idea that, hey, I'm a therapist who understands probably at least a lot of the framework you come from, and I'm willing to work within those parameters. I think some organizations take it too far, where now, again, the church or the deity becomes your licensing board instead of keeping it to the professional standards. And that's one of my complaints of AMCAP, actually. It's a big reason as to why I helped found the Mormon Mental Health Association, which actually has come out with a position statement around all of this that we've been talking about why we do not find the sex addiction model helpful. And if people are wanting to look for therapists who have signed that code of ethics and agree with us on that regard, but are Mormon culturally competent, that's a good directory to go to. And I guess I'll just say, we did a great podcast that you can refer people to as far as the sex positivity that you can very much find within a Mormon construct. And I think it's a beautiful possibilities that people can say, just like Jay and Kristen were saying, as far as bringing things up for exploration. One of the nice things about being culturally competent and ethical is that you can do that in a way that doesn't push people towards having to have certain beliefs about healthy sexuality. And so, for example, I can say something like, well, it's interesting that you interpret that teaching that way. I work with a lot of Mormons, and it's, I've seen Mormons interpret that same scripture in many different ways, and here's some of the ways I've seen that done. And what do you think about that? That's, in essence, an example of bringing something up that explores and allows maybe a possibility of a different thought, but doesn't impose that belief on the person, because again, as a mental health professional, we carry a lot of that kind of quote unquote expertise weight that I don't think we're always mindful of. It's hard to remember that we carry a lot of that weight when, and that we just have to be very careful not to cross those boundaries.
I want to move us to a close, but there was one other piece of Dr. Prowse's list of 3 things, and that was high libido, high sex drive, and maybe different approaches that you would take to somebody would do that. Is it drug therapy, etc.? So I'd just love to have your opinion on that, and then we'll just kind of head to end this.
Jay, is there anything you would add to that? I think that pretty much it's what we talked about. Mainly, I think high sex drive is having to negotiate with a low sex drive partner.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't diagnose that as a thing. If somebody just has it, they have it, and they need to find a compatible partner, whatever it is.
Okay.
It's not, to me, it's not a diagnosis or a...
Okay, so that wasn't one of the ones that you would have come up with the way Nikki did, saying, here's some other alternatives.
Well, I think she's just saying that happens to be what they're finding, is that some people have legitimately higher sex drives than others.
Yeah, that's an explanation. That's a model that is an explanation for why this behavior exists. I don't think it is necessarily the same as being a diagnosis of something that needs to be fixed.
Okay. So I guess I didn't know if you guys were going to talk about drugs or various things for, treatment therapies or anything along those lines. So apparently not.
I sure hope not. I sure hope people aren't drugging people out of their sex drives.
Well, I didn't know. I didn't know what when she said that, I thought maybe that's a real, there's certain people that they can measure certain things, and there's compulsive behaviors and harmful and destructive things come out of it, and maybe there's treatments for it. So I just didn't know.
No, but here's something that I would, when you say that, majority of my men come in saying, I just want to shut off all sexual desire. I just want it gone. And they honestly want to know if there's a drug that would shut off all sexual desire and arousal, because it's causing in their minds so many problems in their life or their relationship or with themselves. And that is so sad to me.
I agree. The one drug-related thing I'd say is I have a client who's female who has a very high sex drive, and her partner was saying it was too much. And so she needed to go on antidepressants. So as we often do, you pick an antidepressant that the side effects might actually be beneficial for you. I wasn't involved when she did this, but she picked one that was supposed to reduce sex drive. Well, now, of course, the partner's complaining that she doesn't ever want to have sex. And so this is just not in my book, a good way to manage this.
Hey, everybody. I know we've kept you so long. I know Natasha and Jay, you guys are back an hour later. It's nearly 1 a.m. for you when we're talking here. How would you like to wrap up? Is there things that we didn't talk about, or is there anything you want to reiterate kind of on our way out as our time ends? Jay, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think, this has been a great conversation, first of all, and thank you for inviting me to participate in it. It has been amazing. These are some incredible people that I'm fortunate enough to be connected with. I just think that everything we talked about here is everybody's on the same page of we want people to have good, healthy, happy sex lives and be satisfied with their sexuality. And there's no reason that can't happen, but we have to look at how to really do that. And we want to base it on strategies that actually are based in how we really operate and, what the science says. And I think that the addiction model, we can argue about the intent behind it, but I think it was trying to address a problem, that what people perceived as a problem. And it's time that grow and change, and that we start recognizing that it is not the end all be all, that there's a lot more we know now. There's a lot of ways that it is not really solving what we thought it was solving. And change can be slow and hard, but it's time we do that, because everybody deserves to be happy.
Super. You know, there were quite a few times that it came up to my mind as somebody who's studied Thomas Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts, you know, in science. And it does seem to me, and I don't know if this is something you guys, any of you have thought about, but this is the model that we see. You know, the way that everyone, of course, this is the way the world is, and then some new, you know, some data that comes out that doesn't match the old way, and then more data and more data, but people are still ensconced here, and that at a certain point, a whole paradigm shift happens, and yet it's slow because there's so many factors that are involved with the old model, and my career was made in the old model, and my funding comes for folks that, you know, think the old model is the best way to go, and things like that. And is that something that any of you guys thought that maybe you are just sort of, we're seeing this Kuhnian kind of transition going on here, and the shift will be made soon or sometime?
Well, I was just comparing it to when we made the move from geocentrism, where the Earth was the center of the universe, to where it wasn't, and the resistance to that, and how the church played a role in persecuting people who tried to suggest that that wasn't true, and what a slow process it's been. It was of going through changing people's minds, because they're looking at something that on the surface made sense and emotionally resonated with it. We're the center of the universe. Makes perfect sense, right? But that struggle of making that shift. And it's interesting that even today in the U.S., they say 20% of people believe that the Earth is the center of the universe. We may have a long battle ahead of us.
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. Thank you, Jay. We sure appreciate you coming and hanging out with us here in Mormon land, and in our culture, and you know, battles that are going on right now within us, and your perspectives and your background, and how articulate you were even this late at night for you. It's early in the morning. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Kristen, let me go to you next. Not for any other reason than Natasha's, you know, our anchor. You know,
Yeah,
she's kind of been the person. She's been our go-to person, and she's the one a little bit that kind of caught the flack that Jay was just talking about with the shift in when a religion sort of says you're wrong and we need to ostracize you or something else. But Kristen, where would you end today with any amplifications or new things that you definitely wanted to make sure came up?
Well, I think pointing people, if people are interested in, if you Google search right now, help for porn addiction, you're going to get a lot of treatment centers. You're going to find a lot of self-diagnosing websites that will confirm, because there is no diagnostic criteria. It's not in the DSM-5. And so what you're going to find are really vague criteria that most people that are sexual beings will meet at least 2 or 3 criteria and could qualify as sex addicts. So that's the first thing I would be throw out there as an FYI. You can most definitely find yourself as a sex addict if you go through Google. If you are looking for help to answer your question, consider going to an organization called AASECT, which is AASECT.org. And that's where you're going to have people that have been trained in addition to their master's degree in becoming a therapist. It's like getting a second master's degree, and are going to approach sexuality as all of it, and not pornography just being the total slice of it. They're going to look at all of it in context and in the big picture. And so that might be a valuable resource for people to go to and to explore a bit. And just, again, I just want to really hit home, be mindful of, Jay said this, people can have a lot of letters. Anyone in the state of Utah, and most states can claim that they're a sex therapist. There is no state regulation around claiming that title. That doesn't mean everybody is. And it also doesn't mean anyone's had a single class in human sexuality. So just do your homework when you're seeking out help, and knowing and try to know to the best of whose couch you're sitting on and the approach they're going to take in helping you.
Super. And thank you. Thank you for all the work you're doing in our community. And,
Thanks for having me.
Being so generous with your time here. And man, Kristen, let's have you back on.
Thank you. I'd love to.
Appreciate you. Natasha, star of the universe of Mormon
Oh, my
sexuality and all that good stuff. You and Jennifer and Kristen and the other Kristen and everybody, just you're teaching us all so much. What didn't come up today, or what would you like to kind of reemphasize as we go?
I think everything came up that I was hoping would. I am just so lucky to have people like Jay and Kristen in my life, and so many people. I mean, the fact that Nikki Prousey would return my email is just, kind of just a phenomenal thing going on in my life right now. And I feel that way about many of kind of just top-notch professionals that are in our country, and even international professionals that are as concerned about these issues as we are in Mormon land, as you put it. I'm so glad Kristen brought up some of the logistics about, self-diagnosis or spouse diagnosis. I think it's really important to not fall into that, in a sense, kind of trap where anybody can be diagnosed, because the questions are pretty vague and open-ended. And so thankful of the reminders from Jay that we all have very similar goals, even if we disagree heatedly with one another in the process. But I really do believe that. And it's in that sharing that I find a lot of, I think where I can calm myself down and not be maybe as hurt as I am sometimes by just the difficulty of getting some of these messages across, especially when I see such profound work being done in my office and in other people's office, when people are really willing to listen to some of these ideas and go forth in ways that they had never imagined possible, and the intimacy I see in marriages and the freedom I see in adolescents and single adults, and just the well-being that is so profound. It's incredibly hurtful when I'm unable to message that in a way, and instead I'm seen as a danger or pro-porn or, other ways that may have been characterized. It's painful because I know that I have very similar goals with most Mormons out there. And I love my Mormon people. I love being a Mormon woman and therapist. And it just kind of keeps me in the fight, even though sometimes it is a little bit exhausting. I felt a little bit exhausted today, and I'm just grateful for people in my corner that lift me up when I'm feeling those things. So I'm very hopeful. I think that we are in the information age. I believe in that. I think that sure, there's going to be retrenchment and fear, and I get it. I even get why I'm demonized sometimes. I totally understand that, and can be, I think, hopefully quite forgiving of that. I tend to have like these quick reactions. Like I don't always respond well in those first 5 seconds, but give me longer than that, and I'll usually come through. and I can respond better and later after that. But anyway, I just want to, more than anything, hopefully we can start having more dialogue. Hopefully I can be less reactive and have more dialogue with those who I know disagree greatly with me. And I'm looking forward to many years of continuing what I think is a very important part of comprehensive sexual education that needs to revolutionize not only our country, but our tribe we call Mormonism.
Fantastic. And thank you for everything you do. Oh, you certainly have taught me so much through the years, and I'm grateful even when you yell at me a bit.
Well, thanks for having lunch with me.
And, it was interesting in that particular case. I knew that this was a model that, there would be lots of disagreement with that they were working out, but I didn't want to, like, as somebody's telling their heartfelt story, to be, repudiating them, kind of there, or, challenging and stuff. And I even in some ways said, I'm going to wait a couple of months. I ended up waiting quite a few more than a couple of months, and I was glad for these op-eds and kind of those exchanges to be able to do this, because that was that family story, and we've problematized it a little bit, but more honor.
I agree. Everybody has a right to their own story.
Right.
That's
Anyway,
right.
well, thank you, and I hope you got some good things out of this, Natasha, that you will want to share it on your platforms and whatnot.
Absolutely.
But thank you, Mormon Matters listeners. Thank you, Mormon therapists, readers, and Mormon Mental Health podcast listeners. Anybody who's done this. I know we're all grateful for Jay and Kristen and Natasha for this, and let's just wish everybody a wonderful good night. And thanks again.
Thank you for joining us today on Mormon Matters Podcast. To discuss this podcast with others, please check us out at mormonmatters.org. Mormon Matters contains no ads, relying for its funding solely upon the support of people like you, its listeners. To keep it moving forward, please consider a monthly subscription or make a tax-deductible donation today at mormonmatters.org. Music for this podcast was brought to you by Shalane Hunt Clayson. You can hear more of her music by visiting her Facebook page at facebook.com/Shalane's Music. CHELANSMUSIC. The Mormon Matters logo was generously provided by StudioCase.com. Thank you for listening.
Searching my soul. Where, when my aching grows, where, when I languish, wherein my need to know, where can I run? Where is the quiet hand to calm my anguish? Who can understand? He only one. He answers privately, reaches my reaching. In my Gethsemane, Savior and friend, gentle the peace he finds for my beseeching. Constant he is and kind, love without end. Constant he is and kind. Love